Well, welcome everybody. If you weren't aware, this is performance tips for beginners and non-beginners and experts that just want to ridicule me. Somehow they got truncated in the file. My name is Josh Orman. I have my own company called IOZAX Designs. That's IOZAX. There's a story behind it. I can tell you about it some other time because we don't have time right now. I also work for an in-house company, sales organization. But let's start at the beginning and who I am and where I came from. In 2003, I got my accounting degree because I didn't want to talk to people. It was that or sales. I did good at sales, but I hated it. So I went to accounting and found out that's really boring. Shh, I can't tell anyone that. So in 2007, we started a project at our office. It was a rental magazine company, and this was 2007, so you're clear. They were handwriting classified ads, and then hand typing them into a Word document, and then converting that to Excel, manually formatting the Word document and the Excel separately, and then giving that to our graphic artist, and then uploading the Excel file to our website, which then just ends up being a big long string of text. And I was absolutely horrified by that. We had FileMaker 4 installed. They only used it to look up people's ads. And that was all they used it for. It was paper after that. So we had to fix that. So that's how I got started with FileMaker. Our company, our IT department had a copy of FileMaker 8. So I got that from them. We bought 8.5 and 9, and I finished building the system in 9. And then it ran that part of the company for about 9 years before we were bought by somebody else, and they eventually just shut the office down, which started me on a new career path. I became very active on the forums around that same time. You start asking a lot of questions, like everybody, I think like a lot of us here do. And eventually it turned into answering a lot of questions. So I was on the community forums a lot, and fmforums.com. And initially, I was actually mostly on FileMakerToday.com. I also, a couple years ago, started a Slack group. It's a semi-private, invite-only group with the sole purpose of allowing developers to talk about stuff they can't talk about on public forums. It kind of grew, got pretty active and fun. I am the most active member on there. As you can probably figure out already, I talk a lot. So my journey. So it's like I said, I started off in accounting. I kind of became an in-house developer. I was also doing the billing and accounting stuff at that office while I was also building this thing for FileMaker. Once I finished building that initial solution, I started on a campaign to rid our office of Excel. It was really fun. Now I'm back to, after the office closed, I went and worked for an independent developer. We spent a lot of time driving around to clients, and working on their solutions and their custom apps until I went to Pause and Error in 2016, and I got a job offer from my now current boss. Feel bad for my old boss. I was only there for a couple months. But I got an offer I couldn't refuse. So here I am. I'm back working as an in-house developer, and it's kind of nice. It's 15 minutes from my house. There's no excessive hours and no driving 400 miles a week on my car. So it worked out really good. Like I said before, I founded it and I operate IOZAX Designs. Interestingly enough, every year since 2011, I've been Employee of the Year. You can stand up and applaud, it's okay. I am a FileMaker certified developer. I got certified in 15 and 16 this year. I was gonna try to squeeze in 17, but I figured that was maybe a little bit much. I was one of the initial members of the FileMaker MVP program. I probably saw my name listed on the keynote. That was nice. And I was honored last year with the FileMaker Community Leader of the Year award. It's totally taken by surprise, especially because last year was my first DevCon. So I was totally taken by surprise by that. There's a problem with surprising me. I didn't get the opportunity to take a look at my wife's book of etiquette for public behavior. And poor Anne Monroe never saw it coming. So you can tell how this is going to go. So let's talk about performance. So there are some general principles of performance that really help us to make sure that people feel that our applications are fast. Now, obviously, we want them to be fast, but we also recognize something else about performance. Sometimes you have to wait for something to happen. Have any of you experienced that? If you're not raising your hand, you're lying. So when we're building something, what we try to do is take best practices, things that we know work really well. When you start off with that base of best practices, things perform better. Now initially, as we're starting off, we may not fully understand why that best practice is so important, but as we try to deviate from that, usually we figure out why we should have stuck with what we started with. The other important thing about performance is for those times when there has to be a delay, like we're processing a lot of records for something, or we're doing a really complicated find. The goal is to put those delays where users expect them to be. For instance, if somebody was on a form, and they fill out your form, and they click the submit button, do they expect a slight delay? Sure, absolutely. It's a normal expected spot for that to happen. What happens if the delay happens right before they click the submit button? Oh, this company is terrible. They don't know. They have no idea what they're doing. The delay is going to happen somewhere. Like, this stuff has to happen. We have to process these records. We have to do the find. We have to transmit the data from wherever it's at to wherever they're at. So these things have to happen. So it comes down to placing those delays where the users perceive they should be. It may be that the actual find that we're performing for them is instant, but there's something else we have to do after that. So if you deliver them to a found set and then go process other records, because they saw the found set show up, they're assuming they should be ready to go. So one of the things we can do in a situation like that is to now take them to a found set on a blank layout, go process our other records, and then show them the found set on whatever layout we expect them to be at. And users will say to themselves, this thing is fast. I like these guys. I trust them. Trust is an interesting thing about performance. If users get delays where they don't expect them, there is an immediate sense of a lack of trust in your custom app or whatever they're doing. Other principles of performance. Play in the sandbox. Take a copy of your files, and if you're not sure how to do something initially, make a couple copies of it, and in the copy, play around. Try different things so you can see which one will perform better. By doing that, you can save yourself a lot of headache when you deploy something that you're not exactly sure how it's going to work out. And know your users. Whether somebody is on an iPhone or a laptop or the really nice one on the bottom, it affects what we give them, when we give it to them, and how much we give to them. If you have somebody on an iPhone or if they're using WebDirect on an Android, you're not going to deliver the same amount of information you're going to provide to this guy on the bottom that has 3 screens. Your layout's going to be different. The amount of data you show them is going to be different. So these are just some of the principles that we need to think about when we're talking about performance. And I don't know if you've read anything I've written on the forums. It really comes down to this. If FileMaker is slow, we are doing something wrong. It's not a judgment about your development skills. I've been there too. When something is slow, we have done something in a way that we made FileMaker do way more work than it needed to. Or we brought in way more data than we needed in order to process whatever we were doing. There is another way to make it faster. It is our responsibility as developers and power users to find that other way. This is an important concept in performance. There are certain things that we know will definitely be faster. But is it worth going back to try to change things to make it better? One of the things we want to do in performance, we want to make sure that we're hitting those optimizations that have the biggest impact right away. I'll give you an example. There are two functions, and there was a really good discussion on this on the FileMaker community forums a little while ago, between the difference between the position function and the pattern count function. So the idea between those two functions in the use case we were talking about was, does this value exist in a list? So we know two things about those two functions. Pattern count has to run the entire list to figure out how many of that phrase exist in the list or in the string of text. Position, if you tell it to only find the first one because you just need to know it's there, it will stop as soon as it hits a true statement. Here's the phrase, and I stop, and it doesn't have to process the rest of that calculation. Now, you can get into giant debates, which did happen, about which of these two functions you should use to figure out if your value exists in a list. This is a really good example of premature optimization. So in the demo file, which will be in the files after the session, probably a little bit later tonight, there's this file. You choose in the upper left position or pattern count. It has some sample text at the bottom. You choose the word in that text you want it to find. And when you click on that upper left calc thing, it'll flip between position and pattern count. You tell it how many loops you want to run that function so you can get a really good set, see how long it takes for that function to process. And then you click the run button. You flip it to the other calc, run it again. It'll give you both of those numbers. Now, if you're looking at that, you say, all right, what is that number in the upper right? That 10,000, 100,000, 1 million, what is that number? That is 1 million. So it took FileMaker for the pattern count function a little over 62 seconds to run that loop 1 million times. Now, I don't know, that's pretty good, right? 1 million actions in less than a minute. The position function did the same thing in 57.715 seconds. Now you think to yourself, that is an 8% difference. That's actually kind of big. If I could save myself 8% every time I did something, I would absolutely do it. But that's on 1 million repetitions, 1 million loops. So if we go down and look at how many is that per individual loop. So this is it running the function one single time. Can any of you tell me what those numbers are? They're 0. So the number next to it, so they're really small numbers, obviously. So it took a really large found set to actually get this number. If you put in 1 in the loops, you get all zeros. It uses the UTC millisecond function to calculate when it starts and stops. With one loop, it's the same number. That's how fast it is. Does it matter how fast those functions are or which one we use? The answer is no. Because what we see, those two numbers on the right in the parentheses, that represents how many times you can run that function before your screen refreshes a single time. So does it matter which function we use? Absolutely not. Now you can go in and you can try different words in that text. It's 5 paragraphs of sample text. And the numbers are pretty close to the same every time. So what we learn is this is a premature optimization and not worth fighting about. It doesn't matter. So that's an important principle. Now here's another one. This is one that we talk about at our office all the time. It probably drives our CEO crazy, but it's true. There are no magic beans. If somebody comes to you and say, hey, listen, I can come in and I can give you some of these tips and all of a sudden everything will be ridiculously fast. You'll never have performance problems again. It's a lie. Performance happens through testing and measuring. So now we're going to get into some of the more boring stuff, and I'll try my best to keep you awake. I know it's late on day 2 of DEF CON. We're going to talk about FileMaker Server. We're going to go through this kind of quick, and I was kind of joking about this when I said this to people earlier, but it's really what I'm going to tell you. If you want to learn about FileMaker Server, you Google FileMaker Server and Wim DeCourt and read anything he has posted. I'm not kidding. He knows it all. I actually think there are times that FileMaker calls him to ask him questions about Server. Wim DeCourt, W-I-M, last name is DeCourt. Nice guy, great accent. So key areas that we need to focus on when we're dealing with a server. Now this is talking about from a hardware perspective. When we're talking about performance, nothing else matters if our server can't handle the task. It would be like trying to ask me to lift an elephant. I'm a good-sized guy, I have a lot of strength, can't do it. It just can't be done. So if your server is not up to the task, your performance will always be bad. There are 4 key areas that we need to talk about when we're talking about performance. So there's memory. So this is obviously the random access memory, the RAM that we always talk about in computers. Simple thing, get as much as you can. The tech specs recommend 8 gigabytes. It's completely okay to go for more than that. There's also the disk, the input and output of the disk. How fast the FileMaker can read and write to that disk has a huge impact on your performance. In a 2015 DEF CON panel with John Thatcher and Clay Makel and Andrew Paulson, Albert Mark, and Vin Adala, they went through a lot of this stuff and they talked about performance. And John Thatcher talks about, he had a conversation that day with somebody who said, you know, I really appreciate you telling me last year to switch from spinning drives to SSD. Because we did that, we got everything set up, we got it swapped out, we got everything loaded on the new drives, and we were expecting a 30 to 40% increase. What we got was a 300% increase. If you're still on spinny drives, do yourself a favor and get SSDs. Don't get consumer grade SSDs, get quality enterprise SSDs, and you'll be amazed at how much better things happen. Now we got network. Network's a fairly easy one. There aren't a ton of options. So you've got 10 megabytes, 100 megabytes, and 1 gigabyte, and I'm sure there's more coming. The bigger the network, the easier things are going to pass in and out of the server. How many of you have ever moved and had to move a couch up a narrow stairwell? That is the importance of having a big enough pipe for FileMaker and the clients to communicate with each other. The bigger that pipe, even if you're not using it all, it's fine. It's there. Eventually you may grow and use it all. But make sure that that pipe is big enough for FileMaker Server and FileMaker Client to communicate with each other. Processor. Should I get more cores or should I get faster speed? Now ideally you want both because both of them are going to help you in some way. The clock speed of a processor, how fast it can process things, means that the calls that go to FileMaker Server get out of the way faster. They go in, they get processed, they get out. Cores help you when you're doing a lot of things like finds, unstored calculations. If you're using perform script on server a lot, this is really important because each perform script on server thread, call gets spawned as a new thread. So it will use those cores. And if you're using WebDirect, it's really important that you have more cores. Our server at our office right now actually has 32 physical cores, 64 virtual cores. Most of the time the server is just sitting there wondering when we're going to start, but that's okay. We'll make it work eventually. If you're doing a lot of record creation or you're updating a lot of data, that's where a faster core is really going to help you a lot because that processing needs to happen. So there are 3 pieces to that. There's the network. When FileMaker Server receives that network call, it's going to receive all that data. Once it gets it, it's going to process it in the processor and write it to the drive. Having enough bandwidth, having enough processor speed, and having that really fast disk input and output becomes really important in those tasks. You can't always go just by the clock speed on a chip either. If you look at one family of chip and it says that it's 2.8 gigahertz and another one's 3.2, it doesn't necessarily mean that the 3.2 gigahertz processor is going to be faster. There are some chips, especially newer ones, that are just so much more powerful. Even though they're technically slower, they process things faster. Identifying the sweet spot in getting cores and speed, it's not trivial. It takes a lot of time, especially it's a lot easier when you're already working with something. You can look at the statistics and see kind of what's already happening on the server. Where are my needs? Where are the bottlenecks for my users so that you know this is where I need to expand? Make sure you look at the documentation. In the FileMaker Server configuration guide, it actually talks about some tips that help you with performance. They tell you things to do and not to do with the physical server. One of the key ones, make sure the FileMaker Server is dedicated for FileMaker Server. It is going to be really busy. So trying to put other things on there with it, like a file sharing server, uses up the resources the FileMaker Server needs to finish what it's doing and help your users get through their work quicker. There's also in the help documents online, there's a section called troubleshooting in the FileMaker Server help that actually talks you through some of these tips, again, to restore performance on something that started to get slow. Make sure you take a look at those. What do you do when things are slow? There's going to be a time we run into it. We all do. What do we do? How do we help? Well, number one thing we want to do is check disk space. It's actually amazing how often the drive that the files are sitting on fill up over time. I remember where I'm at now. I started there 2.5 years ago, and the data file for our custom app was around 20 gigs. In 2.5 years, it's now up to 30 gigs. In addition to that file, we also have a reporting file that has a bunch of logs in it that is now up to like 35 or 40 gigs. It grows really fast. And if you put those things on a drive that's just big enough, you could end up having problems because as the drive starts to fill up, there are a few different things that happen. Number one, your cache, and this is talking more about the client machine, but the cache on your client machine, if you run out of disk space, FileMaker will start to drop out some of the data that's sitting in the cache, that thing that helps everything go faster. So it'll start losing some of the data and it'll drop it in order to finish what you're trying to ask it to do. So then next time it goes back to access those records that it dropped, it has to re-download them. So you're just asking for FileMaker Server to do a lot more work when it doesn't really need to. Another thing that Clay mentioned in that 2015 developer panel was that make sure that you check to see where the FileMaker temp file is. It could be that the FileMaker temp file is actually not on the same drive as the files. And they could be sitting on a drive that was maybe allocated just for the operating system, and then it got filled up. The top call log. This is a really important one. This gives us such a good way to be able to take a look at what's happening when the server's collecting statistics. What are the 25 most expensive calls that are hitting the server? And sometimes when you look at those, say you have your a cycle set for 10 seconds. Every 10 seconds, you're seeing the same calls from the same user. That's a pretty good idea that something's happening with that user, something they're doing that's causing a massive slowdown on the server. So by looking at that log and taking those table IDs and the field IDs that it gives you, you can trace back and figure out not just what they were doing, you can figure what table they were hitting on and what field. I remember one time we had a situation where things were getting really slow in the afternoon between 3:30 and 5 every single day. Initially, we just made the assumption that the sales reps were just working harder in the afternoon. Totally legitimate reason. When we started to look at it, we recognized there was something else going on. It just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And eventually we had upgraded to FileMaker Server 15 and FileMaker Pro 15 on all the client machines. And one day we were standing behind one of our accounting reps, and he opened up the screen to apply a payment to a client account. When he opened up that screen, there's 4 portals on the bottom that just give him information so he knows what to do. And the second one in did that little spinny wheel. Because something in that portal was trying to bring down a ton of data from FileMaker Server. It was a really old portal that was set up probably 10 years ago that has a nasty relationship connected to it. And that right there caused all kind of slowdown. It was one person, one user, slowing the entire company of 100 people down. We took that portal and we put it in a popover, so he only needed to click on it on the times he needed to use it, which was very rarely, and the problem was gone. Everything was back to normal. They never had a slowdown again, and now they even complain about how fast it is, so that's kind of a nice problem. When things are slow, take a look at the statistics. In FileMaker 16 and before, we could look at it in the admin console, see what things are happening on the server, taking a look at the elapsed time per call and the remote calls per second. Those two numbers will tell you whether or not your processors are fast enough to keep up with all the calls that are going to the server. So when you multiply the remote calls per second times the elapsed time per call, that tells you how long each second it takes FileMaker Server to clear out its its backlog of calls. If that time frame is longer than the collection time period that you have set up for server, your processors are not fast enough or you don't have enough cores. So it's time to take a look at a hardware upgrade. All good information that you get from the top call log. And there's a lot of other things that you can identify too through the same process. Okay, so that's FileMaker Server. Let's talk about the relationship graph. Now, there's not much that I can really demo here, but we're going to talk about a few things that we know we shouldn't do. Now, before I show any of this, I want to just give a caveat. This is in no way a judgment on what your relationship graph looks like. I remember my first relationship graph, and it was a mess. This is not judgment, this is just some tips. If by some miracle one of these pictures happens to be yours, don't take offense. I don't know where I got these from, somebody else gave them to me. So it's nothing personal, it's not an attack. We simply are going to give you some tips that will help you recognize how you can make your solutions faster. So now the interesting thing about relationships is they function on the back end of FileMaker just like a find does. If you don't believe me, ask Clay, he'll tell you. So when you add in relationships, operators like greater than, less than, the exact find, duplicates, the not equals to, and the not equals to, those cause a lot more work to be done on FileMaker Server. So you want to make sure that if you are doing that with a relationship, like there needs to be a reason for it. Try to find another way to set that relationship up other than using those operators. I'm not saying never use them. What I'm saying is be careful with them because they can cause a lot of performance issues. We know as a fact, sorting by numbers is faster than sorting by text. This is something where I was talking to somebody the other day, I think it was yesterday. They were doing a find trying to get a range of dates. I don't remember if it was sales invoices or something like that. But he was trying to get something that happened between two dates. So he was doing a find greater than, less than, and trying to get this range. And it was slow. And he was wondering, like, how do we make that faster? Essentially what he was trying to do was just get the quarterly sales. That is an instance where it is perfectly okay to add a field, whether it's a stored calculation or an auto enter, that calculates the quarter number for you. So now you can use that quarter number in relationships, you can use it for sorting, and you can use it for finds, and it will be so much faster than using those other operators. Portal filters can also work like a constrained find. So it already knows it has a found set. So this is a filter. It's looking in another table. It has a set and says these are all the records that are related. A filtered portal is one where you add that calculation where it reduces that set down to a smaller set based on the conditions you give it. So it works on the back end of FileMaker very much like a constrained find. So what's interesting about that is these portal filters will actually try to use the index to make things work faster. What we need to be careful of when we're using those portal filters is to make sure that that calculation isn't so complex that it can't use the index. Because if that happens, then it has to go through every record in that relationship and run that calculation and figure out, am I supposed to show this to you? And that can get really slow and really kill the performance of your custom app. Complexity of the graph. When we're talking about the sheer number of table occurrences on your relationship graph, it's a consideration. The fewer there are, the easier it is for FileMaker to process and do everything it needs to do. Does everybody here know what a table occurrence is? And you know that you can have multiple table occurrences of the same table, right? Relationships between those table occurrences is also really important. Now, what's important to remember about relationship lines. So if you have two table occurrence groups, who knows what table occurrence group is? I just want to make sure we know what it is before I move on. So a table occurrence group is on that graph. So they say you'll have people and invoices and they're connected together. Then you may have another group that's not connected to those two that are connected to each other, but not the original two. Each one of those is a group. If you were to then, say you had two table occurrence groups that had 4 relationships in each one, so that's 8 relationships. If you draw a line between the two table occurrence groups and make them related, how many relationships is that? It is not 9. It's 16, 17, because you have the one drawing between them. So if you go into a complicated relationship graph and you draw one line from one table occurrence group to another, you didn't add one relationship. And I'm going to show you how in a hurry that can get you into a lot of trouble. Complexity of relationships, we're going back to what we were talking about in the first piece, using those operators. If you have a lot of those down the string of relationships, you can expect FileMaker Server to scream at you. It's going to slow down. Also, the number of table occurrences that are based on the same table. So you have your invoices table. If you have that invoices table on your graph 4,000 times, you're going to run into problems. Now, I know what you just thought to yourself. Did he say 4,000? All right, I'm going to show you a graph. Again, I don't know where this came from. Somebody else gave it to me. This is the graph at 100%. Doesn't look too bad. This is the same graph at 50%. 25%. I almost had to lay down when I saw this. And that's at 3% zoom, you're looking at everything. Now, it's a little hard to see on this screen, but there are a lot of little lines on there. This is going to sound bad. I'm surprised this opens. Like, that's a lot of stuff. Here's another one. So in between each of those groups, and it's kind of hard to see up here. Let's see if this works. Ooh, there we go. So in between each of these groups, there are lines going from here to here to here to here, over to here, up to here, and then back. This person was complaining about performance issues. So make sure you take care of your relationship graph. It is really worth it to make sure you spend a little bit of time cleaning it up and making sure you have on there only what you need. So layouts and objects. Here's just a few reminders that you've probably heard before. If you haven't, you can go search more about them. When your file opens, open to a blank layout. The first thing that FileMaker is going to try to do when it opens up that file is try to pull down records for you so it's ready for you to use. It's nice like that. But it can cause performance issues. What happens if you open up to a table that has 1.5 million records on it? FileMaker has to do a lot of work, and it may take several minutes for your custom app to open. Whenever possible, use form view, especially when you're processing records for something else, something maybe the user doesn't necessarily see. Form view is faster than list view. And make sure you're using themes. How many of you are using themes pretty thoroughly? How many of you don't know what themes are? How many wish I would tell you what themes are? All right. So themes are just basically you tell FileMaker that for everything I assign this style to, for instance, a field, I want it to look like this. The important thing with themes is to make sure that you don't see, it's kind of hard to see on here, but do you see the red triangle? See if I can do this again. Right there. So that red triangle tells you that the object that you're sitting on right now does not comply with the theme style. It has something that's different on it. Now, sometimes that's okay. It won't cause a lot of issue if you have one of these. But if your layouts are filled with them, what's happening is FileMaker is storing all that data about what your field looks like with the field. When it's complying with the theme style, it only says, hey, here's the theme style, this is what I should look like. FileMaker can go back to that theme, look at the style, and say, okay, I know what this field is supposed to look like. If it has a lot of local CSS, which is what it's called, when you go search for this, that's what you'll see it talked about, local CSS. The file stores the theme and the style. It also stores all the different pieces of information that are different about that one field. For instance, if your style says that the text should be black, and you have it colored blue, it will store all the information around it being blue, in addition to the style. Now, as you get more and more of these, Richard Carlton had a video a little while ago that he really broke this down and showed why themes are so important. You could end up having literally hundreds of megabytes more of data being brought down from the server just because you don't have themes applied. If you're on something 15, FileMaker 15, 16, 17, and you're still using classic theme, get off of it as quickly as you can. There's so much extra data there that's just not needed. And it will help you. You'll see things will get a little bit faster. It is my greatest contribution to my company. Okay, so avoid unnecessary objects. This is one of those situations where we can fit nearly an unlimited number of fields, objects, and shapes on a layout. It's amazing. Don't do it. Just put what you need. There are a lot of things that we can do, little UI tricks that are nice, and they're fine. Just don't get carried away with them. When you have so many objects, especially for somebody that's going to be working over the WAN, somebody that's working remotely and they're not in your office 10 feet from the server, it's going to have to transfer all of that data for every object across the network. If they're on an iPhone and they're using their cellular connection, it's going to be really terrible for them. If they're working on a laptop remotely in a coffee shop over VPN with a spotty connection, it's going to slow them down and you will hear about it. Gradients. Don't you love gradients? Gradients can really enhance the look of your layouts if they're done subtly. I had a screenshot that I got, my fingers got a little twitchy earlier and I accidentally deleted it, couldn't find the file so you don't get to see it. But it was essentially the background had a gradient. Every object on the layout, and there were about 800, had gradients on them. Every button had gradients on them. Some of them going different directions and different colors. I got dizzy looking at it. Gradients are fun. Don't get me wrong, we all went through that phase. But be careful with gradients because having too many of them, it's really expensive for FileMaker to bring down all that data and then render it for you. So just keep that in mind. An important thing to keep in mind when FileMaker is rendering the objects on your layout is that FileMaker will not evaluate something it doesn't expect for you to see. So something that is naturally hidden on the layout, for instance, it's on the second tab of a tab panel, or maybe it's off the screen, or maybe it's in a popover. Whatever it is, FileMaker knows you don't need to see it yet, so I'm not going to calculate it. I'm not going to fire the calculations. I'm not going to render this object. It's really, really helpful that way. That piece of truth helps us to understand a lot of other things that we can do to use that behavior to our advantage. Have you ever heard this? We get this all the time at work. Everything's broken, nobody's working. You go up and you check it out and there's 2 people down. It's fine. But there may still be a problem. So as we start to look at these things, one of the things we want to look for when we start to see slowdowns, especially as they start to become consistent as more and more data builds up, take a look at your filtered portals. Make sure that your filtered portals are efficient. So what do I mean by efficient? When a portal tries to filter the records for you, the first thing it's going to try to do, like I said earlier, was use the index. When a portal can use the index, it's really fast. The filter will happen nearly instantly. There's not a lot of drag behind it, and it'll work well on even several thousand records. But that also means in order for it to use the index, the calculation basically has to be this field equals a value. If this field equals 1, a constant. This field equals something that's in a global field, or it equals something that's in a variable. That's a pretty straightforward relationship. FileMaker can 100% use the index to figure out where all those records are and say, here's the bit list of the records you need to see, and the portal displays that, and it's fine. How many are you familiar with a Cartesian join? That's the X join and the relationship graph. Does everybody know what that does? That essentially says, between this table and this table, I want all the records to be related. We're one big family. It's usually a bad thing. So if you have a portal on your layout that uses a Cartesian join, so it's related to all the records in the other table, and then you just put a filter on it, say, I only want to see all the people named Josh. Josh is a great name, let's just see those guys. That will work fine when you have a few hundred records. But as you get a few thousand records, a few 100,000 records, you probably wouldn't make it to 1 million records with that portal, because you would have fixed it and replaced it by then. Complex relationships really affect layout objects. Calculations, fields, portals, anything that's trying to hit the calculation engine and figure out what the data is from a related set. Those complex relationships go back to what we talked about in relationships. It's the same thing. Using those comparison operators, greater than, less than, those things really have a much bigger impact on FileMaker. And sometimes you hear people say, well, then FileMaker's doing something wrong. No, they're not. FileMaker is doing 100 times more work than it was with just an equal join. Complex calculations. I know they sounded like the same thing, but they're not. There are some calculations that you can write that will not only get the information you wanted, but it'll actually ask FileMaker Server to send back everything, and that's bad. Some things to try. When your layouts are loading slowly, there's 2 things really that could be happening. 1, there's just way too much data coming down from the server. Or 2, there's something on the layout that's not rendering correctly. So in Xcode, this is only for Mac. I don't know what the equivalent is for Windows, but I know there is one. You can actually throttle your network connection so it thinks it's like a 3G connection or just a slower connection. When you throttle that connection and you slow the data down and there's not really a difference in performance, your problem is not data. The problem is something that's on the layout already that is having a hard time rendering. So that once you know that, you can go looking for it. So how do you find an object that's on the layout that's offensive to the FileMaker Server? Well, this is called the binary search. So binary search says that you take half of the objects on your layout and you delete them. Did the problem go away? Yes or no? If the answer is no, it means it's still on the layout. So you delete half of the objects. Did the problem go away? Until you figure out which group of objects this thing was in, and you can continue to narrow it down until you find the offending layout object or objects. It's really effective. Do it all the time. So why is layout and objects and all that important? Does it really make a difference? So there's a company that I did some work for. They had an iPad app, and they were using a synchronization product to move data back and forth between the server and this iPad that wouldn't have a network connection at their trade shows. So a couple things with this, what I'm going to show you. So on the left, when this switches, it's going to go to the default layout from this sync product. Now, there is nothing wrong with this layout per se. There is nothing wrong with the sync product. I am only showing you this because we accidentally stumbled on something that blew our mind. So on the left is the original layout from the sync product. On the right is a change that we made. There was a flashing going on with a tab panel that was on the layout, and it was making the users upset. So we had to fix that. Now the interesting thing with this product is it generates the script steps for you and the tables and the fields. So we couldn't touch the script steps, we couldn't touch the fields and the tables, because if we ever had to go back and regenerate them, it would undo all the customization we did. Not to mention, the script is 8,000 steps long, and it continually loops back on itself as it's calling different parts of itself. I would have no idea where to even put the steps to try to keep track of where it was. So on the right, what we ended up coming up with, it's a layout that tracks where the sync progress is, and it uses only button bars, text objects, and conditional formatting. The conditional formatting watches the field that the sync product sets, and from that I figure out where in the process of syncing we are. Watch the difference. It's amazing, right? There are no other changes between those two syncs. The data is the same, the sync is identical. We ran this probably 25 times because we couldn't believe that it was twice as fast. The one on the right took about 6 seconds. The one on the left took 13. More than twice as long to do the same process, and the only thing we did was take that original layout and move it off of the actual layout space. It's still there, it's just off the right. It's out of the way. And put those objects in. It gave a nicer user experience, and the performance went up drastically. Is that cool? All right, let's clap. All right. So that tells us the layout objects greatly affect what happens, how fast things happen. So we need to pay attention to that. All right, now we're going to start to move just a little bit faster. I listed a bunch of stuff on here. If you want to talk to me about it afterward, that's fine. But I want to get to just a couple demo things that I had set up. And then I want to make sure I leave time for Q&A. Okay. One of the big things we know is calculations only fire when they're shown. We're going to show this in a demo so that you know it's absolutely true. If a calculation does not show on the layout, if it doesn't show to the user, it does not calculate unless it's referenced by something else that does. Freeze window, I'm a big fan of freeze window. There was a long time in Windows where if you use the refresh window script step, you would get that weird flashing. If you use freeze window at the beginning of the script step, when the script ended, the window would just refresh on its own, no flashing. So I'm a huge fan of freeze window. Not necessary for that anymore, but it's really beneficial. Freeze window means FileMaker stops rendering the screen until you do something that changes the window. Most often that's the end of the script. And at the end of the script, it will refresh the window. The user never sees everything that happened in between. Perform script on server. This is a really good way to take the burden of processing a lot of data off of the FileMaker client and putting it on the server. Again, there has to be a balance, because if you do too much perform script on server, you'll crash the server. So you've got to find the sweet spot. What things really need to happen on the server, what things don't. Fines on unstored calculations. Sometimes what happens is FileMaker Server says, I don't know what you want. Here, take it all, and you figure it out. When you have to download all of the data from a table to do a find, it's going to be ridiculously slow. Try to avoid doing finds on unstored calculations. They are useful for many things, but they are not good for anything you have to do a find on. All right, some tips. When you go to do a find, before you go to the layout that you're going to do the find in, go into find mode. What happens now when you're in find mode and you flip over to that new layout, FileMaker does nothing. It's just waiting for you to enter some criteria and process the find. If you just go to layout and then enter find mode, sometimes FileMaker will download a bunch of records thinking you want to be able to see these. Go into find mode, make that one of your best practices. Enter find mode, then go to layout. Finds on related fields and in the external SQL source finds. Try to stay in form view instead of list view. That will make an impact. For ESS, only go to list view when your found set is down to a relatively small number. Because again, this is a different process the FileMaker has to wait on a different server for to get information. Binary search. This is not just for finding offensive layout objects. You can also find records that are in order. So if you have items that are in a list, in a table, and they're all in like numerical order, or they're all in date order. A binary search is a really good way to find a specific record if you can't do a normal find. Like maybe you need to jump down to a record, but you don't want to loop through each one to find the one you want to stop on. You go down halfway down the record set using go to record, and you figure out, is my number before this or after it? If the number's before it, you go halfway back, and you just keep moving halfway until you find the record you're on. You'll find very often it doesn't take more than 8 steps for FileMaker to find the record that you want to sit on. 8 steps like that happens nearly instantly on FileMaker. Tog hopping. This is a new term I learned. I've been using the technique for a while. I just learned it had a name, so it sounds really cool, so tog hopping. So tog hopping is basically this. So we're talking about a table occurrence group. If you were sitting on a people table in a table occurrence group, and say you need to process some invoice records for them, but the invoices table is not in your current table occurrence group from the layout you're sitting on. But there's another table occurrence group down here that has both the people table and the invoices table on it. Now, instead of trying to recreate your found set in that other layout that's based on that other table occurrence group, you can just jump down to that new table occurrence group. So you use go to related record, and you tell FileMaker that first drop down on the top, where do you want to get the related records from? You want to get the related records from the table you're already sitting on. Then underneath that, where you choose the layout, you simply choose the layout that's based on the same table in any table occurrence group you want. When FileMaker does that go to related record, it's instant. We're going to show that in just a few minutes. Use get found count to determine the related count records. If you put a unstored calculation in a child table, and it is simply get found count, what happens when you're sitting in the parent record is you know exactly how many records are in that related table by only looking at the first record. Now we know that FileMaker will download all of the record data for a record for every record we touch. But get found count just tells you how many records there are. FileMaker doesn't have to process anything else. It just knows, yes, I have this many records. When you ask for that value of that field from the first record through the relationship, FileMaker doesn't send anything except the number. So instead of sending, if you say you're trying to get a value from the last record that was created in the child table, you can say, all right, what is the value of that field of get found count? All right, there's 8,000 records. Then you use get nth record to grab a value out of a field from that record of that number you just got. And now you don't have to touch any other records in that related set. It only sends you back the data from that one record. The performance impact is pretty incredible. Okay, so we're going to go back and we're going to take a look at just a couple demo files that I have made. Okay, so I have 3. We're not going to get to one of these. We're not going to have time. All right, so this particular database is simply sales data. In this table are two summary fields that tell me how much is the total of the sales for the found count or the found record you're sitting on. So for instance, if I go and do a search on Europe, so it'll take this just a minute because I finished this demo like 15 minutes before I walked in here, so it needs to update that index. This will only happen the first time. If I had turned the indexes on like a smart developer, this wouldn't have done it either. Okay, so we have 389,000 records. Do you know what happened if you jumped to this layout and the summary field was already on the layout? So right now, I can jump through any of these records. I can go to any record I want. There's no delay, no slowdown. But watch what happens as soon as I display that summary field. Now, I already clicked on it. Did you see that long delay? Now, you're saying to yourself, it wasn't that long. But what happens when I do all 1.5 million records? Again, there's this giant delay. Your user is going to see that. You can't stop it from showing. That incredibly long delay is a performance impact that your users don't expect. Hide the summary field or the calculation until you actually need it, and you can keep things going really fast. So again, that field's hidden, and we can move back and forth between these records, no problem. Cool? All right. Now here's the tog hopping. So there are two layouts in this table. There's one that I'm simulating. There's only two table occurrences in this whole table, but I want to just simulate what's happening here. All right, so you see there's only the one file. We're going to do a find, and we're going to find all of our female clients. We want to send out a special note to them and a thank you for being clients. You can see there are 618,000 records here. If you were to do a Gordo-related record from this table to another table, matching all of the found set, what would happen? You would hear the server joking. So we want to jump from this people table, which is not connected in any way to our invoices, down to an invoice table occurrence that also has the people table occurrence in the string of relationships. Ready? 1, 2, 3. It's already done. That action is absolutely instant. We can do that same thing going the other direction. Let's say we want to show all 1.25 million records. We hit go. It's there. It's already done. This is really important because you can start to save found set. Say you need to restore a found set. You need to go do something else, but you want to bring the user back to the same found set they started with. You could generate this window off screen somewhere, process the record, do the changes, and then bring it back and restore the exact same found set the user was on. That's just one of the use cases. If you're processing invoices, you can do the same thing. You can jump down to that other table occurrence, do all the processing of all the invoices and the invoice line items, and then jump back and take the user back where they were, all without incurring the performance hit of doing that particular Gordo-related record. Now, there may be other things that slow you down, but it won't be that. So that's tog hopping. You may not exactly understand how to use it now, but knowing about it, in a few weeks, you'll probably find a way to use it. And actually, I don't even know that it was a script. It actually might have just been a single. Yeah, it's just a single step. So there's the Gordo-related record. So you can see from the people table, we're sitting on the people table. We want to relate ourselves to the people table, but just show it to us on the invoice people layout. And that's where it goes. So I've been using this for about 7 years, and this has always worked. So I think in the Gordo-related record, if you were actually jumping from the people table to the actual invoice table, I could definitely see that happening. All right, so that's that. Just two quick things, and then we're out of time. There are a bunch of references for where I got this information from all here. When I upload the slides to the FileMaker community site, you'll be able to access them and get all of those details. We don't have a lot of time for Q&A. I actually think we're out of time, but I will be up here for a little while. I'll be around, so feel free to come up and ask me questions, and we'll go from there. Have fun. Oh, and one more thing. There will be updates, and make sure that you fill out the session evaluation. Tell them how great and how wonderful this session was.